remember last time we got together at this park?
Yeah.
Like this?
Yeah.
And we talked about how our universe started and how the universe made all the stars.
Yeah.
And one of those stars was our sun. And then our Earth came to be. What do you remember from that story? Can you tell me some things you remember? What do you remember, Emma?
The sun was starting out as little baby was
Yeah, the sun started out as just a little baby. Does anybody else remember something from the story that we told?
started out as a baby too.
The Earth started out as a baby, that's right. The Earth was swirling gases that came together. Does anybody else have something fun they remember from that story? How about you, Griff?
It was like great rain for like
A lot of rain. Very good. One more?
It was spouting soy.
It was way?
Spouting soy.
Yeah, there was lots going on. Well, there was a part of the story that I remembered. And I remember that there was a lot of chaos, but that the universe decided to give some of the particles rules that they needed to follow. And 3 of those particles were the water, the rocks, and the air. Do you remember that part?
Yeah.
How we had different particles? That's right. Well, that's where we left off, is where our Earth had formed, and did you have a question, Knox? Yeah?
How did the Earth form?
How did the Earth form? Well, it was made up of all those different particles, right? And so we gave them lots of rules. So the heaviest particles sunk to the middle, and then the water formed on top, and then the air formed a blanket around the Earth, right?
Yeah, but
And
the
so-
Earth's not very warm.
Not today. But so we had these different particles, and we thought that this perfect order was ready, right? Well, the air around the earliest Earth was not like the air that we have around us today. Today we have this beautiful blue sky with a few fluffy white clouds in it, and the air is full of nice, clean oxygen that we breathe. But when our Earth first formed, scientists think that the air was actually orange. And it was orange because it contained all sorts of chemicals that would be toxic to humans like us. Like, it had tons of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and nitrous dioxide. And so even though we thought we had this perfect order, something started to go wrong. Griffin remembered that it rained. And it rained. And it rained and rained and rained and rained and rained and rained and rained. And as that rain came down through that orange sky, it picked up some of those chemicals. And when that acid rain that was full of the chemicals hit the rocks, it started flaking off some of those rocks. And the rocks started coming into the sea. That doesn't sound very orderly, now does it? No. Here we thought we had set all these rules and everything was going to be in a perfect order. Suddenly it wasn't anymore. So, something had to happen to put everything right. And that one little thing that happened, remember our tiny speck of a universe became everything?
Yeah.
Well, a tiny speck appeared somewhere on Earth in some sort of water. And we don't know exactly when, exactly where, but a brand new kind of particle came to be. And that particle had its own set of rules. First of all, it had sensitivity. That meant that it could feel and respond to its environment. The rocks can't do anything if the rain hits it, right? They just have to sit there. And the water has to follow the rules. It goes up when it gets hot and it comes down when it cools. But this new particle was able to respond to what was going on around it. It also had the ability to eat. That's right. Did you guys have some lunch before you came today? Yeah, that's right. Living things have to eat. And so that's a difference. That was what made this particle so special. It was sensitive, it could eat, but even more importantly, it could make more of itself. Can a rock make more of itself? No.
What if it breaks?
If it breaks, it still just keeps the same amount of rock, right? But this tiny little particle looked like a little blob of jelly just hanging out in a puddle or an ocean somewhere, we don't know exactly where. But this particle brought life to our Earth. That particle, that little blob of jelly, was called a prokaryote. Can you You guys say that? That's a big word. Prokaryote. That's right. Guess what? We're surrounded by prokaryotes today. Right now, sitting right here. The very first life on Earth is still with us. You may know it as a different name. Have you heard of bacteria?
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of bacteria are single-celled organisms, and they're still prokaryotes, just like those that brought life to this Earth. And that tiny little particle was the beginning of all of life on Earth. So, here this tiny little particle was hanging out in the seas. It got hungry, and luckily we had all those minerals from the rocks that were in the seas. And so that little particle started eating and making more of itself, and then those particles started eating and making more of themselves. But they didn't make exact copies of themselves. They would do little experiments and make little changes. So each time, some of those experiments were successful, like maybe they grew a little tail called a flagellum so they could move through the water. Or maybe they put a little thicker shell around themselves so that if they bumped into something, it wouldn't hurt so much, right? So as these tiny little single-cell creatures ate and made more of themselves, they were doing all these experiments and changing and making things different. But at this point, the only food we had were all those minerals that were in the seas. Eventually, food started to become a little bit scarce. There wasn't enough to go around. So some of the experiments that these creatures did, or these first little particles did, is they figured out how to find new food sources. So a couple of them looked around and said, well, there's just a bunch of dead organisms over there. Maybe I could eat those. So all those years ago, we had our very first scavengers. Do any of you know scavengers that live with us today on Earth? Have you ever seen a vulture or a buzzard? Or have you ever heard of the hyenas? Yeah, they like to show up and they will eat organisms that are already dead. So scavenging is a very old way to get food. So it's a perfect source of food. Still others looked around and said, man, look at all this beautiful sunshine that we have. Maybe I could use that to give me some energy. Does anyone know the process when an organism uses the sunlight to make its own food? Liam? Starts photosynthesis, that's right. And a key product that comes out of photosynthesis is oxygen. What do we breathe? Oxygen. And what was the atmosphere back then? It was not oxygen, right? So because these early organisms figured out how to make oxygen, they made a world that could support even more kinds of life. They made so much oxygen, these particles were called cyanobacteria. So they were a bacteria, but they were a more plant-like bacteria, right? And they made so much oxygen that they actually added a level to our atmosphere called the ozone layer. You heard of the ozone layer? Yeah, it's a special layer of our atmosphere that protects us from the harshest rays of the sun so that we can sit out here today and enjoy the sunshine. But even through scavenging and photosynthesis, food was still hard to come by. So a really clever organism saw another one swimming by who was still alive and thought, well, I'm bigger than that guy. Maybe I'll just eat him. And we had our first predator on Earth. An animal that eats another living thing is called a predator. Who's your favorite predator?
Lion.
You like the lion? Cheetah? Yeah, those are good ones.
Sure, my second favorite. Mine's a cheetah.
A wolf? Yeah, we have awesome predators on Earth now, don't we? Well, when you eat a living organism, you have more energy, and that allowed these new creatures, we call them eukaryotes. Can you say eukaryotes? We had prokaryotes, right? And now we have eukaryotes who eat living things. They had more energy, which meant instead of just being made up of one single cell, they could make more cells because they had tons of energy, right? And if they had more cells, that meant they could have some cells that were in charge of eating and some cells that were in charge of growing, and they could give them different jobs. And that is when they became so efficient that they could start to make changes really, really rapidly. All right, I know I've been doing a lot of talking, and you know why? Because all of that took about 3 billion years to happen, okay? So for 3 billion years, the only life here on Earth were these itty bitty blobs of jelly that were just floating around trying to figure out how they were going to make more of themselves, right?
Everything is kind of
That's an interesting thought. All right. Well, over those 3 billion years, even more and more experiments started happening. So you see here on our timeline, we're going to start, and we just have these little bitty blobs of jelly, and they have single cells. Well, then once they had different cells doing different tasks, we had the Cambrian explosion of life. This right here, you see this bar? This is our Cambrian period. So during the earliest part, we just had all of life on Earth. We just had these little cells, but then they started looking more like creatures. So we had trilobites, which are kind of like ancient lobsters, and they were some of the most plentiful creatures on Earth. You can find fossils of trilobites anywhere. In fact, some of you could even find them in your backyard if you were looking. We also had cephalopods coming along. So some of these creatures felt a little itchy, so they grew these shells on outside of themselves. But in order to break through the shells to eat them, they had to have strong beaks. And in order to get the food up to their beaks, these cephalopods grew their arms and their legs straight out of their heads. Could you imagine having arms and legs? Yeah, straight out of your heads. Pretty crazy, huh?
That's silly.
Yeah. Some people some scientists have described the sea of lilies, that there were sea lilies. These little crinoids here, they look kind of like flowers, but they were actually animals. They were just rooted to the seafloor, but they still ate creatures as they came along. All right, and then today you might even recognize these. How many of you have been to the beach or the ocean? Did you see any jellyfish or starfish while you were there?
I try with the sand dollars.
Yeah, sand dollars. Yeah, so some of these creatures, the sea sponges and the sea squirts, they are some of the first life that came on Earth. All right. Well, all of these different creatures kept eating and making more of themselves and doing more of those experiments until a little more time passed, and we got our first fish about 470 million years ago. We got some of our first fish on Earth. So the next form of life to fill the seas after the bacteria and the jellies and the sea lilies was our fish. And the fish were special because they had moved some of their skeleton to the inside, and they now had a backbone. Can you feel your backbone?
Yep.
Yeah. Do you know a more scientific name for an animal with a backbone? Liam?
A vertebrate.
A vertebrate, that's right. Our first vertebrates came along 470 million years ago. Now the fish, even though they had their backbone, they didn't look like the fish that we know today. They didn't have any jaws, so they had to hang out on the sea floor and just suck their food up, all right? And that made them pretty vulnerable because everyone knew where to find them, right? So they grew these really hard armored scales on their body. But that made them really heavy and not very fast. So a couple of their relatives decided they wanted to swim faster. And so those hard armored scales become those light scales that cover fish today. And they grew a jaw so they could open their mouth real wide and snatch their prey out of the water, right? And then they also grew some fins so they could swim and change direction. So as you can see, for the earliest part, all of our life here was in the sea. The sea was a really lively place, but up on land, it was a very different, you can just hold it, thank you. Up on land, it was a very different story. Do you remember the volcanoes that we showed at the end of our last story? Yeah. Knox, can you be quiet, please? Thank you. Laurel, please. Knox and Laurel, please pay attention. Thank you. All right. Up on land, we had volcanoes that were erupting regularly. The sun was fierce and strong, and there were huge winds that were blowing. It wasn't a very hospitable place, and so all of our life was taking place underwater until some of that cyanobacteria got washed up onto the rocks. And when it got there, it was able to latch on and grow a little bit. And then some of that carried off through the wind and landed in other swampy areas. And all of a sudden, we did have life up on land. We had our first plants. And this is the beginning of what's called the Devonian period. So we had all this life under the seas, and all of a sudden we had all these plants up there. All right. Well, do you know creatures who like to eat plants? Yeah? Yeah. Well, I tell you what. Some of those arthropods, these trilobites, and some of these others that look kind of like early lobsters, well, they like to eat plants. And so they looked up there on land, and they're like, man, look at all that deliciousness. And guess what? There's none of these horrible fish running around trying to eat me. Why don't I go up there, right? So some of the arthropods figured out how to make their skeletons extra hard and keep all of their water on the inside, so they didn't have to live in the water. They could take their water with them. And that's how we got our first insects up on land. All right? So we started with plants, then the insects came. Well, do you know anybody who likes to eat insects? Yeah, lots of animals do, right? So,
especially frogs.
yeah, especially. So some of these fish looked up on land and thought, huh, look at all those tasty insects running around, and no one else is trying to eat them. Maybe I should get up there and try to eat them. So the fish started wiggling around and started trying to move their fins in such a way that they were able to support themselves just enough to crawl out of the water up on land and snatch up some of those tasty insects. Okay? So that is what brought us the first amphibians, the frogs that Laurel just mentioned. What do you know about amphibians? They do like to eat bugs. Where do they live? They can live on both water and land, but they have to be near water. Well, guess what? The bugs got smarter and they moved out farther, and the amphibians needed to be able to chase them. And some of those amphibians got real tired of having to stay close to water, okay? And so, they decided to make a tougher skin. That meant they could stay away from water. And they figured out that their eggs needed to have really hard shells to protect them because they couldn't be there with them. And in order to move faster to catch all those tasty bugs and even some of the amphibians, they had to lighten up their skeletons. So they got a couple of holes in their skull. And that is what brought us the first reptiles. Well, guess what? Now these insects had amphibians and reptiles chasing them. So you know what they decided to do?
I think it just
They decided to grow some wings and go up into the air. And so that was the first time that we had living life up in the air. All right. Well, about this time, some big changes started happening. Have you ever heard of the supercontinent called Pangea? All right. Well, after we're done with our story, you can come up and look. But the land on the Earth has moved and changed a lot across time. But this is the time that Pangea came together. So we had our supercontinent. That's right. The climate started to become drier, and so a lot of those amphibians that needed water were struggling to survive. Do you see this gray mark right here? Well, this gray mark, and you'll see we've had a couple we just haven't mentioned. This gray mark signals a mass extinction event on Earth. Does anyone know what extinction means?
The animals died.
That a lot of animals died off. That's right. And so, right at the end of the Paleozoic era, the Permian era, we had a big extinction, and over half of all living things on Earth died. A lot of those were amphibians, but the reptiles, they were able to survive, and they ushered in the Middle Ages of Earth's life, the age of the dinosaurs. Yeah, you all remember the dinosaurs, right? All right. Well,
Without the volcanoes, there would be no life.
without those first volcanoes? That's right. Isn't it amazing how all of these things happened and brought us the dinosaurs? Dinosaurs ruled our world for 160 million years. That's right. Some of them even grew flaps. those were actually called pterosaurs rather than dinosaurs. Y'all know.
And without volcanoes during the floods of the war.
That's right, Ever. That's right. So we had the Triassic period, we had the Jurassic, and the Jurassic is when a new little creature appeared. So the dinosaurs were growing bigger and bigger and bigger, but they were cold-blooded, and so as they grew bigger, they had to find lots and lots of food sources, and they were dependent on the sun. So some little creatures started forming, and they were able to hide from the dinosaurs because they were so small. But we're going to talk about them in just a little bit. So toward the end of the Jurassic period, we entered the Cretaceous period, and something new entered. So we've had plants, we've had these big ferns that were all over, but a new kind of plant appeared, the flower. Can you believe that all this time had passed and no one had seen any beautiful flowers yet on Earth? So our flowers joined us toward the end of the time of the dinosaurs. Something else happened. These pterosaurs that were flying around started growing some more feathers, and their wings started getting started allowing them to glide farther and farther distances. And this is about the time that some of our earliest birds came to be. So we've met our amphibians and our reptiles. Now we've met our birds. All right. So here we are. We're at the Cretaceous period. This was the point where the dinosaurs were really ruling the world. They were huge. Maybe some of your favorites? T-Rex? Stegosaurus? Triceratops? Yeah, so some of those biggest dinosaurs were toward the end of the Cretaceous period. Well, something happened again. Because as you can see, life on Earth isn't always easy. There's always something that's going to happen. All right, well, there's a couple of theories out there. And they either think a gigantic asteroid or an enormous volcanic eruption happened. Could have been both. The volcano could have been caused by the asteroid. There's evidence for both. But what happened was that the sun started to be blocked by all the dust and debris from that asteroid impact or from that volcanic eruption. That caused some of the plants to die off. And so these huge dinosaurs who ate plants didn't have enough plants to eat, and they died off. And when the plant eaters died, the meat eaters didn't have enough to eat either. That's right. And so, unfortunately, the end of the Cretaceous period brings us another mass extinction, and that is when the dinosaurs died. Now, the dinosaurs that had become birds, they were a lot smaller, and they were able to survive, even though they had less food. And remember I said there was another tiny little creature over here?
Like
All
those boys.
Well, this creature didn't need the sunshine for its warmth. It was warm-blooded, so it could keep its own self warm. And instead of dropping their eggs in a nest and running off, they grew their babies inside their bodies so they could keep them safe. That's right. And when those babies came out, they decided to help take care of them. And so those itty-bitty creatures and those itty-bitty birds were able to survive. So now, in addition to the reptiles and the amphibians and the birds, we had mammals on Earth. That's right, and that is what brings us to the Cenozoic era, right here. And you'll see this is how long dinosaurs ruled, and this is how long that the mammals have been ruling the Earth. And so without those gigantic predators, those dinosaurs around, the mammals were able to grow, and they were able to diversify. In the last 65 billion years, the time of the mammals, we've seen some that are huge, like the whales and the woolly mammoths. We've seen some pretty impressive predators, like the saber-toothed cat. But of course, there's one very special kind of mammal. About 65 million years ago, a mammal started to stand upright a little bit more, and they started to grow some longer arms and longer legs. Those primates were a very special kind of mammal. First, the primates were monkeys, and then they developed into apes,
And then humans.
right? And then a very, very short 130,000 years ago, a very unique creature appeared on Earth.
Human.
This creature didn't have fur. This creature had an enormous brain.
Like that.
And this
Humans.
creature had abilities like no creature that had come before it. But you know what? I think we'll leave that creature story for another day. So,
Yeah, we've been told a lot.
so when you think about how old your parents are or your grandparents are, let's think about just how old all of life is on Earth and how many